Hi, and welcome to the Gist with Joe. I'm here today with Zevi Slavin. Zevi is the creator of Seekers of Unity, an educational project and community dedicated to a collaborative, comparative, interdisciplinary exploration of mysticism, exploring the unity of the world's mystical traditions and the intersection of philosophy and mysticism, the East and the West, ancient and contemporary, in the hopes of creating a more intimate, tender, and caring world together. Zevi, how are you? I just combined both your names together. Zevi, how are you today?
Awesome. Great to be with you. Thank you for having me on, Joe.
Yeah, of course. I'm, really thankful for you to be on. So,
Pleasure.
um, as you might know, as we talked about, this whole channel is to help people gain an introduction to some serious thinkers on the YouTube platform, specifically serious thinkers in the fields of either theology or philosophy or psychology. And what I think is really cool about your particular project is that you're blending philosophy, theology, and psychology. I know they're blended often, but you do it in a really interesting way, and you're blending all these three disciplines together in the good of mysticism. And so, with that, I would like to shut up and have you explain what you think the gist of the project that you're doing is. What's your goals? What's your vision? Really, what's Seekers of Unity all about?
Wow. There's so many ways to dice it. How do we how do we do this? I think that let's begin perhaps from a religious context and then shift into the philosophical and psychological.
Sure.
I think that religiously speaking, there's one of two dominant narratives that we here in the West are raised on. We're either raised with one religion, typically, and there are exceptions, of course, but we're typically either raised with one religion or with no religion. One religion means that this tradition that you're born into is the truth, the only truth, the eternal truth, and everyone else is mistaken or wrong or worse. And then the other option is that there's just no religion at all. We're secular. We believe in the progress of science and materialism, and that's all there is. And there's no greater mysteries that we need to know. Those are sort of the two big camps, and I think that between those two big camps, there's obviously a lot of varieties in between, a lot of ways that those manifest. But there's a growing middle space where people who are either disenfranchised or disenchanted from either of those two camps are moving into a middle space. Again, a very diverse space, and this is a huge like generalization covering millions of individual people with individual thoughts, right? But that
Sure.
middle space where people like, hey, maybe there is something about this religion story, but it's not one which is particular to my own tradition. It's something which is human and something which is true beyond my own small narrative and community, beyond my own people of faith, that there's something larger going on here. And in a way that can be reconciled with the science and with philosophy and with psychology. So that's sort of the religious perspective. And that opens up a space. Sometimes universalism is used. It's not a word that I love. The word that I gravitate towards more is perennialism, which has its own history from the Renaissance and onwards,
Yeah.
where there's shared truths in all faiths. Let's say it like that. Then on the philosophical side of things, there's ways of thinking about reality that are different to dominant philosophical narratives. Philosophy has less sway in contemporary society just because of the nature of religion versus philosophy as the capacity to move people. But philosophically speaking, there are competing narratives, and a philosophical narrative that undergirds contemporary science, although it claims to be free of philosophical assumptions, is only one vision of reality. And there are alternative visions. And I think that the vision of philosophical mysticism, the vision of the mystics in the world's mystical traditions, the various traditions, they combine to tell a new story, a new philosophy, and a new version of religiosity, which is also a very old one. And to me, it's not primarily a religious or a philosophical or a psychological story, psychology in this context being the brainchild of philosophy, but it's a
Sure.
human story. It's humans that are having human experiences and are trying to articulate the depth of their truest experiences in a way that compels them to goodness and kindness, in a way that's rigorous and thoughtful and working through with their own traditions. So I try not to make any too broad metaphysical claims in my own work or in the project, but to ask what is the human story that's emerging, and can we get beyond our own little blinders and see a bigger story? And that's the project of seeking unity, of looking beyond our own boundaries of my religion, my philosophy, my this, and see what is the common human narrative that's being told here, and is it one that we feel might be one which is helpful, one which is good, one which is beautiful and true, that we may be able to hold on to and to take us through to a better tomorrow. That's in a small synopsis of it.
You did a great job tying that in. You did a really great job at the very end, just crescendoing that, and no,
Thank you.
that was a great explanation. It really was. And if I can rephrase to just put in the most simplest terms, it sounds like what you're saying is Seekers of Unity, and what your project is all about is trying to invite and facilitate people to see the patterns and the symbols of reality. And if we can see the patterns of reality and realize that these patterns actually exist, that these patterns are universal, maybe that might inspire us to, well, exist differently and exist more optimal. Because the hope, I guess, would be, right, you see these patterns and how these symbols and patterns ultimately rise up in a hierarchy, and that hierarchy, the head of that hierarchy being God, right? So it's helping us see these symbols and patterns expressed possibly, I mean, for your case, in the tradition of mysticism, and how can that help us go up and perceive and be aware, be attentive of this hierarchy that ultimately leads to God.
Yeah, I think that's a very beautiful way of putting it, and it's fascinating to be engaging in these sort of conversations at high levels of abstraction, because you get to hear the way that you've sort of unpacked, and you've studied Catholic theology, systematic theology, from what I understand, and the way that you're interpreting it through your own lens, me coming from a very different world, and we're trying to meet somewhere in the middle. It's a very, very beautiful and complex abstract dance that we're doing here. I would be a bit more careful in my formulation. I'm speculating, yes, about potential patterns, and patterns is a great word here, patterns in reality, but I'm not making any claims about reality as such. I'm beginning, at least in the opening volley, for the first 5 minutes of the podcast. I'm first trying to observe patterns in human experience as recounted in human testimonies about their experience, because we don't have access to humans' experiences directly. That's the nature of experience. But so patterns in the testimony of mystics from various traditions, and then when we put those patterns of testimony together, what are the theories they're saying? What are the patterns in amongst their cosmologies, theologies, theosophies, metaphysics, cosmogonies? Perhaps we can then begin to speculate about patterns in reality itself, and we can maybe also begin to deconstruct the binary of experience and reality. But I'm not making any claims about reality just yet. But
Sure.
I think first make claims about human experiences and human narratives based on those experiences.
I know, and that's a very careful way of putting it, and I appreciate that. Your explanation got me thinking, because I know this is not, I am very, well, let me put this carefully. I feel accurate in this proposition I'm about to say, is that you are not advocating for this like henotheistic way of approaching God, or approaching how we experience religion, right? Now, what I'm curious from your explanation right there is, do you think that if you aren't careful enough in the content that you're creating, to the average viewer, do you believe they can walk away from watching some of the videos on Seekers of Unity and believe in this more like henotheistic way of perceiving God, their henotheism gods, therefore, like, oh yeah, there's multiple gods, but this God's better, and this God's better than this God, and then it becomes like a hierarchy of gods.
Right. So, I mean, it's always a terrifying challenge being in the role of an educator of what is it that you're saying and how is that going to be perceived and received and taken away. And it's even more challenging when you're talking to the internet. You don't know who your audience is. You can't see their faces. You can't hear their questions. It's truly terrifying. And I know that I have my little brother who's a 16-year-old kid in yeshiva, still in a Hasidic education that I was raised in. He's listening to some of my stuff, and then it's an atheist and a scientist and a philosopher from Kuala Lumpur listening as well. So it's very hard to.
Right.
I try and speak carefully for that reason.
Especially when you're talking about mysticism. That's what really, possibly convolutes this, is that, I understand what you're saying when you're talking about, looking at different mystical traditions and trying to find possibly a common ground. But I'm sure you're very careful because you don't necessarily want to, maybe you do, I don't know. You don't want to necessarily speak a message of complete relativism or pluralism.
No, I'm not promoting any particular epistemological agenda as such. I think that let's go back to the question that you posed of God, of henotheism. Henotheism, just for those that need a refresher, is the belief that there are multiple gods, but that our God is the most powerful. That's at least a simple description of what henotheism is.
Very good, simple, way of putting it. Good.
So I try. A lot of the work of theology and philosophy at its finest is simply the work of redefining language. Language is so essential to our experience as humans, and when we're using language well, things can have at least a hope and chance of running well. Communication, construction, instruction, relationships, and when communication is poor, then there's very little chance for any of that. So part of the work of the philosopher and of the theologian is to clarify language, and I think that a lot of the work that I'm doing is to clarify certain points here. This is a point that Wittgenstein makes, that all disagreements are just misunderstandings of language. So words like mysticism, words like God, are all words which need a lot of work to be unpacked, explored, rehabilitated, reused, reconstructed. These are all very, very loaded and difficult words. I think that when I'm talking about God, when I use that 3-letter word on the channel, I don't mean what most traditional, conservative, fundamentalist, religionists think of that word. I'm using that word very differently. I'm using that word as the mystics use it. It's a placeholder for that which is unknowable, but is being and the ground of being itself, from which all emerges conceptually, and to which all returns. It is absolute nothingness, and it is absolute being. It is absolute infinity and finitude. It is the coincidence of opposites. I'm not talking about a beardly figure who takes people from one country to another and fights their wars and answers prayers. I'm not talking about that.
Exactly.
I'm not talking about the God of your grandmother, to put it simply. Your grandmother may be a theologian.
My grandmother's a little Italian Catholic who believes that God lives in the sky. So,
well, so I think, and listen, I'm not saying this. I have nothing against grandmas, and I have nothing against.
Right. Yes.
I have nothing against sort of infantile theologies, and I think that when we are infants, those theologies are very helpful. And we're infants at many points in our lives. We can be adults, and we can need to turn back to the God of our childhood. And that's okay. I think in times of prayer, in times of need, these are images of God that we conjure. But when I talk about God, I'm not talking about a God who competes with other gods for dominance and supremacy and power. So the question of henotheism is not a question which I think would even apply to the categories that I'm talking about. I think if someone comes away from my channel thinking that I'm arguing for monotheism or henotheism or polytheism or atheism, I think that they've completely misunderstood what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to entirely redefine, along with great mystics and theologians, what that 3-letter word means in its entirety. And I think it's a word that, when it's redefined, is a reference to reality itself in its highest potential conceptualization, which demands us to live up to it in certain ways. If I use the word God the way that I think it means, that makes a moral and ethical demand upon me to treat all of reality as such, with
Yeah.
kindness and compassion, the face of God itself. So I'm not even entering like questions of one God or many gods, or
Yeah.
I'm talking about reality itself, and the mystic is the one who encounters reality as such.
I mean, mic drop. I don't even know necessarily what that was great, great way to like sum that up. And I think that's important because I mean, you don't know everyone who's watching your channel. And I remember actually, so we talked about this before we got on the air. I told you that I was a former high school teacher. I actually remember showing, and I forget exactly which video it was, but I remember showing a video of yours to my high school uh, senior class, and this class was a world religions class. I was teaching world religions at the time, and a bunch of 17-year-old kids, they might have explored your channel a little bit, and you go back to this infantile notion of belief, or not God rather. And yeah, I don't know what the perspective or what they would take away, because again, when you, and like we talked about this before, it's when you're operating up here, right, and you're just entering the door into this thought, it might, you don't have the lexicon, you don't have the proper, maybe you don't even have the complex thoughts yet of trying to really understand what you're trying to advocate here. And so I think that what you just did was a great explanation of what your mission is for your channel. And I want to go and I want to talk about more convoluted words, conflated words, and that word obviously being mysticism, right? So again, maybe either people who are watching your channel, watching this channel, or just individuals who are somewhat interested. I mean, everyone today, I feel like in the West has somewhat of an interest in spirituality, of mysticism. I know this and I see this because I see how many different metaphysical crystal stores have popped up in my city, right? I see the teenage girls that I used to teach where, you know, I wear my cross. But you know, if I was a 17-year-old girl, this would be a crystal. Even for the young guys, right? My wedding ring, for example, if I was 17, well, if I was 17, I wouldn't be wearing a wedding ring, but right, it would have a crystal in the middle. And so that's misguided. And I strongly believe that that's misguided. I strongly believe that they're not doing necessarily anything in bad faith. They're just simply unaware. And again, we even see religiosity come out in how we interact with political parties. We see religiosity in how we interact with conspiracy theories. I actually think that we live in a highly religious world now. I think possibly that we live in one of the greatest times of religiosity than the world has ever seen. Again, it's just misguided and unaware. And so I look at the term mysticism, and I know that people who are Christian, who are Jews, who are Muslim, who really, I specifically actually in the monotheistic traditions and the traditions of the book, they might see that word mysticism and it conjures a lot of negative connotations. The secular individual might see mysticism and just automatically connect it with this new age crystal weaving, you know, tarot card passing out way of expressing spirituality. This isn't good. This is not good. I will say that with how conflated this term mysticism is, it actually is a huge disservice for what you're trying to do with your intellectual project. You did such a great job explaining how you do not advocate for henotheism. Can you do an even better job explaining what you believe is an accurate definition or explanation rather of mysticism?
Yeah, you laid out the problem so eloquently and so well, and I couldn't agree with you more on how equally important and convoluted the understanding of this word is. and it's not a new problem at all. There is a scholar who said that there is no word that is more convoluted in the English language than mysticism.
Uh,
Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, to only make the problem worse, said that even in the scholarship, even in academia, where things are typically a lot more clear than they are in public jargon and discourse, he says that every scholar of mysticism has their own definition of mysticism. So we're kind of up a creek on both sides. Both in the public, the word is used incredibly radically and poorly, and then even in the scholarship, there's not a whole lot of consensus on what the word means. A lot of my work is to try and move towards a consensus of the definition of mysticism. Seekers of unity is a broad term, and it's seeking unity in many things. One of them is to seek unity, to seek a unified definition of mysticism, and that's work that I'm doing for the channel in upcoming videos, upcoming series, trying to tackle the concept of mysticism itself. And we've started some of that, looking at the history of mysticism, the development of the word, history of the concept, the term itself, back to its ancient Greek etymology, through the early church fathers, through all the way up to Schleiermacher, William James, and Huxley until the present day. And that's important work as far as I'm concerned.
it is.
I think that, so let's talk then about what the definition is. Mysticism comes from the ancient Greek mystikoi, which literally just means the one who is initiated. Initiated here, speaking about the ancient Greco-Roman mystery religions, where the most famous, those of being Eleusis and Dionysus, which every Greek citizen, anyone who was anyone, went to experience. We don't know a lot about what they experienced because they were not allowed to repeat what they saw on punishment of death. But we do know that from the little smatterings that have escaped, we do know that there was some kind of revelation of divinity. And in the face of that revelation, things like mortality, death, became a joke. And so we begin to
When you
hear
say a joke, can you just clarify? I think I understand what you mean, but just for everyone who's watching.
Yeah. That there was no reason to fear death anymore. It was incomprehensible. Like there was an embrace of divine immortality, let's say. And there's different theories of what exactly went on. There's a lot of scholarship on this. My very good friend and colleague, Philip Home, over on Let's Talk Religion, has made a fantastic, one of the most concise presentations on the internet on the Greco-Roman mystery religions. I recommend checking that out. Fast forward a few, because the word goes through a very long, complex historical development, and something which we cover at great length in that series. But speaking today, just because the brevity of time, today there are two definitions of mysticism that I push for. And this is after having done a survey of hundreds of definitions throughout for hundreds of years until today, and work which I am going to present on the channel, God willing. But the two best definitions that I found, and kind of amalgamating a few really leading scholars on the field today, obviously picking amongst camps, and then there are different camps. There's the perennialists, the constructivists, the contextualists, and these are things which we discuss on the channel. But the two definitions are, one of them is from early in the century, a Anglican scholar by the name of Evelyn Underhill. I have one poetic definition and one technical. So hers is a poetic. She wrote what was for many years the most popular book written from a scholar to the public on mysticism. It's just, the title is Mysticism, looking at Christian mystics. She wrote another book called Practical Mysticism, an incredible scholar. She defines mysticism as, the phraseology changes between her texts, but the one which I like best is, mysticism is the art of union with reality. One more time. Mysticism is the art of union with reality. Sometimes she says the science of union with reality, but in
like art,
the art of union with reality. And that's an important definition, because mysticism is one of the first connotations is the magical, the superstitious, the woo-woo, or the escapist. We're looking to get away from the world. And there are reasons why we have that conception. And Underhill's definition is so beautiful, because what she's saying is, it's not about getting away, it's about encountering reality itself. It's about uniting, the art of union with reality. And that's what we spoke about before, uniting with God, uniting with reality. Sometimes she uses the capitalized R to represent the divine reality. That's a poetic, important definition, and I want that definition to be out there in the airwaves, because it counteracts it cuts through a lot of confusion. A more technical definition for those that are a bit more categorical or philosophical in their thinking is an amalgamation of definitions given by Peter Moore and Bernard McGinn, two very, very brilliant scholars of mysticism. The definition is that mysticism, if we bracket the historical and ontological questions, right, bracket what's happened socially and what may be the metaphysical reality lying behind this, is three things: is unitive experiences, and there's a variety of potential mystical experiences. They can be ecstatic, they can be contemplative. There's various forms of that. Unitive experiences, unitive theories, and I'll explain what that means in a second, and unitive practices. Unitive theories are theories that we humans employ to try and make sense of the unitive experiences which we have, and humans have this. I think the recent Gallup poll shows that 1 in 5 Americans report having a self-described mystical experience. And I'm focusing here on the unitive component on this, partially because of William James and others, but I think it's really the core of the definition here. And then when we try and understand our everyday reality, which is not unitive, which is pluralistic and multiplicitous, when we try and reconcile those two, we come up with theories of mysticism. They're unitive theories. Those are things like a great chain of being to explain the relationship between the one and the many, the most classical problem of philosophical mysticism. And then there are practices. And so theories are metaphysics, our theologies, our mythologies, sciences. These are all theories of unity. And then there are practices. Practices split into two camps. It is techniques to try and bring on a mystical experience, to try and get us into that space. And then it is the ethics. How do we behave going forward in our lives, having experienced what we experience and knowing what we know in theory and practice. Bernard McGinn's spin on this is that it is everything. He describes the unit of experience as an encounter with God. He's using theistic Christian language, and I would just, to make that a bit more comprehensible, I would replace God with reality, to use Underhill's term. And McGinn says it's everything that leads up to that encounter, the techniques that lead up to there, and everything that flows from the encounter, which is both the theories and the ethics, the practices. So however you want to schematize that, unitive theories, unitive experience, unitive practices. And I found that an incredibly helpful way to both make sense of what's happening in mysticism, to pass out when you're reading a text. Am I right now reading a technique? Is it experience? Is it theory? Is it practice? And also an incredibly helpful way to maintain balance, because when scholars will study mysticism, sometimes there'll be an overemphasis on experience, sometimes too much theory, sometimes too much practice. And this keeps all three in a nice balance of one another. So those are my two definitions of mysticism, as concise as I can give them over. The art of union with reality and unit of experience, theory, and practice.
And Underhill, it sounds like her, poetic way of defining mysticism. How I just framed it in my head is it's like the mother hugging it's like the mother hugging the child. So the second way in which you define mysticism, and here's the deal: complex things sometimes cannot be explained very succinctly. Obviously, I'm really happy that you just didn't give like a 1-2 sentence explanation for mysticism, and you did it actually. And with that being said, I mean, you did really actually describe it succinctly, but I think you know what I'm getting at. But it's like Underhill just gave that hug. It's everything that you just explained in your second definition can be understood when Underhill says what the art of union with reality. And I really think that's just so beautiful. There's just so much to unpack here. There's so much to unpack here, but I want to, the first, one of the funny things that first came to mind off the recording, we talked about Tolkien for a second, and it's so funny. I talked about SCOTUS and how the connection with Tolkien possibly. It is funny that Underhill, great mystic writer and thinker, in the Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien uses the last name Underhill. And I don't think that's probably not a deep connection, but I think Tolkien probably had the pulse on the mystical experience and mystical ideas. I would not be shocked if he was aware of that, but I don't know. That's a different conversation.
That'd be very interesting. I don't know enough
Me
about
either.
his influences, but that would be a nice little Easter egg.
So I'm curious. You were one thing, and this kind of goes away from exactly what I was discussing, the order of the conversation, but I'm trying to like bridge all these things. You just did a great job explaining what this idea, really this reconstructed vision of mysticism is. We had that conversation because we first talked about how people are, well, misunderstanding this notion of mysticism, and sometimes they're conflating it with secular New Age practices. Okay. Do you think, oh, and you also mentioned the Gallup poll. I think what, 60% of individuals claim that they have.
Yeah, a significant number. Yeah.
Sure. So a significant number of adults claim they have a mystical experience. I'm curious what you think of the usage of psychedelic drugs to, what's the word I want to use? The usage of psychedelic drugs to introduce a possible mystical experience. This is something that and again, why I bring this up is because I'm trying to bridge this enchanted, constructed vision of mysticism that you present. I'm trying to bridge that, and I'm trying to make sense of that with this more new agey way of understanding mysticism. And yes, I know people will disagree, but I am actually going to put the usage of psychedelic drugs in the more new agey secular field of trying to initiate a mystical experience. I'm curious if you've ever thought about the usage of psychedelic drugs. Are they appropriate to begin a mystical experience? Or is it to do that, is that in bad faith, you think?
It's a complex question. I want to maybe take one step back before stepping back to this question. I think there's an assumption, and I'm trying to just like listen carefully to what you're saying and try to communicate effectively. I think there's an assumption that's made that mysticism is inherently a category of religion.
Yes.
And I'm not saying I'm not saying religious, because that's a very loose word, and religious could mean different thing. I could wash my car religiously, and that could be a fine usage of the word. I mean religion here with a capital R. I mean institutionalized proper forms of religion, not religiosity per se. So that's the assumption that's made that mysticism is a subcategory or a function of religion, capital R. It's not only an assumption that's made by the public. There are scholars that take this opinion or that have taken this opinion. Gershon Shalom, who I mentioned earlier, one of the leading scholars or the leading scholar of Jewish mysticism of his generation, very famously claims in the opening pages of his magnum opus, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, that there is no such thing as mysticism outside of religion. I think Shalom is wrong, and most scholars today think so as well. I hope he forgives me from the grave for saying this, but I don't think that I'm looking at mysticism as a human phenomena. I'm looking at religion as a human phenomena. And those two phenomena often are conflated for good reason, because the mystic encounters what they feel to be the numinous, the divine, and therefore is part of religion. And whether that's part of the inception of religion or the regeneration of religion, revival, that's also a complex question. But they certainly become connected historically. That's with no denial. But I do think that mysticism, unitive experiences, unitive theories, and unitive practices can happen outside of the context of religion, outside of the context of theism. I think there's a debate amongst the scholars whether certain schools in Buddhism should be considered mystical. There's a strong reasons to argue that it should not be considered mysticism. I'm of the opinion, among many other scholars, that it should be considered mystical. It is not mysticism if we think that mysticism is only about uniting with God, which is a Christian or biblical or Abrahamic definition of mysticism. I don't think that's part of my definition of mysticism. Mysticism is the art of union with reality. However you conceptualize that. If you conceptualize reality to be fundamental emptiness, you studied Buddhist theology, Buddhist thought and philosophy, so you'll know what I'm talking about here. If you believe that reality is fundamentally empty, and you can encounter that and experience that and be in union with that because it is what you are, then I believe that is a unitive theory, and one which comes with unitive experience. And it's a complex point, but what I'm trying to say is that mysticism happens without theism and without religion. So to your point then, I think that if someone is taking psychedelics, let's say, psychedelics happens also, I appreciate what you're saying, that you're putting psychedelics in the category of New Age. It's also worth mentioning that psychoactive chemicals and beverages have been part of religious practice for millennia. So
going back to those cults that you were talking about, for me, I mean, that was a part of that was
yes,
a big
yes,
aspect of those traditions.
Yes, in ancient West and in ancient East. So that's important. There is some historical context to add there. But the point you're saying, you're talking about the contemporary form, and I know what you're talking about. I think that if someone is taking a psychoactive drug or entheogenic, whatever it is, and it is engendering what they're self-describing as a unitive experience, right? And they are beginning to theorize, and it could be a scientific theory, it could be a neurological theory. They begin to theorize about how to think. It could even be an economic theory of how do we implement our experience in a way that brings equality for people. These are all unitive theories, and they're undertaking practices to meditation, contemplation, dance, ritual, and ethics to behave more kindly and more gently towards the neighbor because of their experience. I can't see why this would not be considered mysticism on McGinn and Peter Moore's definition.
Sure.
There is some scholars who will debate this and who will say that it shouldn't be considered mysticism at all. I think it's a minority, and it's a losing position in the scholarship. This is a big change. When Aldous Huxley put out his book, The Doors of Perception, where he described his own experience with mescaline, he received so much hatred from both the religious world and the academic world for even suggesting that mysticism proper had anything to do with these drugs. William James, when he imbibed nitrous oxide, and he writes about reading Hegel on oxide, which is one of the greatest philosophical accounts to read. He doesn't write about this publicly, and he doesn't put his name in it. He doesn't go forward with it because he's afraid of the ridicule. And I think if we're going to be honest humans, without like any of our theological presuppositions or any like war on drug political presuppositions, look at these experiences. I'm not advocating for psychedelics.
It doesn't sound like you are. It doesn't.
I'm not saying at any point that people should be doing them, or that it's the right way or a good way or a proper way. That's a whole other question, different discussion. On the question simply, is this a form, a practice, an opening to mystical experiences? I find it very hard to see why not.
Sure. And I would like to, just to reframe, I mean, it does sound, so you're not talking about a mystical experience, capital R religion, but what I think you're presenting here is a mystical experience, little r religion, because if you're talking about how if you take a psychoactive drug, right, and it, as Underhill said, it unionizes you with reality, and reality is God, right? That is little, I mean, so in a sense, it's always going to come back to the religious, but I think, as you would put it, little r, not large r.
Well, yeah, I mean, so if let's say hypothetically, if taking psychedelics takes one back to church on a Sunday,
but not even necessarily church, I guess, if it, well, again, just going back to the definition, I mean, if it allows you to have a greater, I don't even know how to put this. Well, if it allows you to perceive reality more vividly, right? And go on.
No, what I'm saying is that it can bring one back to either forms of religion, to either a capital R or a lowercase r, to either religion or religiosity.
Sure.
And there are people who return to classical forms of religion because of their encounter with the divine or divinities by the use of substances, and it can bring people back to religion, capital R. It can also bring people back to religiosity, which is lowercase r, which is a sense of reverence for nature, a sense of the sacrality of being, the sense of the unity and interconnectedness, and a desire to worship the stranger. I think these are lowercase r, these are religiosity. And I think that psychedelics, like any mystical experience, can do that for people.
Sure. And I think and I don't even know if we would disagree on this, but I think where I stand is that I think it would be completely fine if it sparks religiosity back in the individual. I would like to see that religiosity eventually help the individual return to hard R religion. I just because I think that the coupling of both is when you're really, playing and cooking with fire there. And
Right.
that's me personally. And I want to reframe really quick because I don't want anyone to miscalculate what I'm trying to say. When I say I'm using, or I'm categorizing psychoactive drugs in the field of New Age secularism, I guess what I'm saying is I've never been to a Catholic mass where we start, dropping acid. You've probably never been to a synagogue that's doing the same, right? So that's what I mean. I mean, you're not going to get this in a organized Abrahamic religious setting. You're not gonna see the usage of an organizational body, allow for the usage of a psychoactive drug in a religious institution, in a ritual. So that's what I'm trying to get at.
I appreciate you clarifying that. I want to add two things to that. Firstly, I like what you said about bringing people back to religion, and I think there is a discussion of the value of bringing individuals into community, into ritual, into practice, into faith communities. I think there is a lot of value there and importance. I think that as you mentioned, I think that it needs to go both ways. I think that I would like to see religiosity return to religion and religion return to religiosity. I'd like to see them both come to each other.
That's great. Because you need a framework.
Yes, certainly. You need the letter and the spirit. Yeah. And I think this is an important point. And this is a constant dialectic throughout religion. I will say this on the point that you said, I was thinking that I'm in agreement with you that one does not see psychoactive chemicals being used in classic mainstream. I will say though, while I was thinking about my own religious upbringing, and I grew up in capital R religion, Orthodox Jewish Hasidic community. Part of the Hasidic life is the consumption of alcohol, and I don't know
in what way.
So in Judaism in general, wine plays a very sacred place at just about every major ceremony, right? Same in Catholicism. Wine when circumcision as wine, Friday night, when we sanctify the Shabbat, when we take out the Shabbat and we sanctify the week, Kiddush and Havdalah, there's both wine. At a chuppah, when two Jews get married, wine is there all the time. On the Pesach Seder is 4 cups of wine. We're not like Muslims who cut wine out of religion. Wine is very, very central. While it's also recognized to, and in addition to that, there are certain times throughout the classic Jewish year, and this goes all the way back to the Talmud and earlier, where one is obligated not just to drink a glass of wine, but to actually become inebriated.
Okay.
Purim, the festival of Purim is a classic example where the Talmud mandates religious Jewish males to become inebriated to a very specific degree on this day of Purim. So wine and alcohol, inebriation, these, I don't know. I'm not in the science. So I don't know whether alcohol is considered a psychedelic or psychotropic or what its exact definition, but it's a mind-altering drug. That's what it is.
That's a safe way of putting it. It would not be considered a psychoactive drug, but mind-altering that's undebatable. That's correct.
Right. It's a drug which induces altered states of consciousness. That's for sure. So in the Hasidic community, this is taken it a bit further, the Hasidic community has its roots in Eastern Europe. In Russia and Poland, things were very cold, and drinking alcohol was part of the lifestyle there. And as Hasidism immigrated to the New World to America first and then across the world. I grew up in Australia. Those traditions, those customs, the Hasidic community is a very traditional community. So we keep our garb. I grew up speaking Yiddish in Australia, a Eastern European Hebraicized version of German.
Sure.
So it's a very traditional community, and alcohol is part of that traditional practice. And part of it is actually used not just ritualistically, not just like, oh, here's a ceremony, here as some sort of symbolic form, you drink a glass of wine. No, there's a Hasidic practice, a very, very important Hasidic practice called a Farbrengen, where Hasidic, typically adults get together to it's a complex thing to describe, but it's a space for reflection and growth and song, and for encouragement and for criticism. It's almost like a form of group therapy or group spiritual growth.
Yeah.
And there's different forms of it. It can be peer led. It can be led by a teacher. There's different forms of this Farbrengen. And it's done on certain times throughout the year, and more sporadically in other occasions. But part of it is the drinking of alcohol. It's set to a certain limit, and you cannot just get smashed, but you can get quite tipsy with it. And the point of being tipsy is to enable your spiritual development and growth, and your closeness to God, and your closeness to your fellow peers in that spiritual community and body. So, it is there. I mean, this was a long time.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a wonderful way of framing this. And I didn't necessarily, I didn't even think of it like that. In the Catholic tradition, obviously, and for people watching, I mean, obviously wine, as Catholics believe, and as Eastern Orthodox believe, I mean, it turns into the blood of Christ. But wine would be the physical substance that we use that God uses, right, to come into it. So, and I wouldn't say we necessarily, I mean, I obviously, you're not getting tipsy from sipping wine when you go up for Holy Communion, but I mean, I don't want to necessarily get into it right now, because I feel like this conversation could last like 2 hours, just this specific conversation.
Yes.
But I am thinking, I know that got my wheels turning. I think that you are correct in that. Wow, that's good. That's good. That's
This is
good.
totally, by the way, this is totally like a tangential footnote. But yes, but I didn't, yeah.
No, that's great. We'll talk about that one day. I mean, we should talk about that another day, because I think that could help. Well, that could just help the conversation that we originally started with.
Yeah, I think it also opens up the question of, like, if we're already consuming mind altering substances, i.e. alcohol, in our religious settings and communions and communities, what is the gap then to go on and to be? And I have friends that are working within the Orthodox world to try and introduce psychedelics. I'm not part of that movement, and I have my own criticisms, critiques, and thoughts about psychedelics as an outsider. But I think it's an interesting bridge into that question. It's like, if you're already having half a cup of vodka or whiskey to try and develop in your own piety and depth and religiosity, what's the difference between that and smoking weed or LSD or whatever it is? So it's an interesting question.
The only thing that's getting in the way is just this like judicious legalism, or this very this Western American morality that
it's a form of traditionalism of, like, this is how it was being done back in the shtetl, back in Poland, and therefore then that's why we do it, and they weren't dropping LSD together.
So that's a good question. I'm gonna try to bridge something that I want to also bring up, and this is my way of trying to bridge this gap. So, okay, our discussion on psychedelics or mind altering substances that could help us actually reach a greater union with reality makes me think of Scotus, the Catholic theologian that you've talked about many times on your channel, at least you brought up many times on your channel, and how essentially, I don't want to try to like sum up the thought of Scotus in 15 seconds is a sin in and of itself, but Scotus, a believer that God unfolds himself into existence, and therefore, you can see God. And this is something that the Catholics, I mean, you see this in even the mysticism of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, that God is in all things, that God, I think we talked about this off the air, really just like whispers this like lyricism, and that lyricism allows for existence to move and to start up. And again, bridging this gap, maybe, psychedelic or psychoactive substances, well, maybe God also whispered in those things to help the human experience. I want to get away from the psychedelic and the mind altering stuff, though, and I want to talk more about Scotus. And I want to talk about what you say about Scotus in your channel. Well, first of all, I love your channel because how I've looked at it, it's like set up like a book with different headings and chapters. And I love that you start off with a section, and then you have multiple videos explaining that section. And I see it now, like and I love how you do it. You have this like air of like mystery about it. I watched that trailer that you're gonna do with Let's Talk About Religion with John Vervaeke. And I mean, I guess I won't ruin it, what the secret word is, but I have a good idea of what it is. But I love that. And so like that's the next chapter, right? Or that's the next section.
Yeah.
And what I'm getting at is, so you have this chapter on pantheism, and you talk about the well, you just talk about how expressions of pantheism really throughout East and West. And I thought it was funny that you did, I liked your subtle mocks at Western medieval thought. I didn't agree with them, but that's okay. I consider myself more of a, if I was to pick the two between Plato and Aristotle, I'll be on the side of Plato. So me and you come into agreement there. But I love the subtle dig that you give to the Aristotelians. And I don't agree with you. Again, we won't talk about this now. I must say, I don't agree with you. I think that scholastic theology is very important. I think in many ways, people just look at it as, well, not people, but and I don't want to be reductionistic here about this, but I do think that there's more of like a poetic reality of scholastic theology. I do love scholastic theology. As I mentioned off the air, I do think that Scotus, obviously influenced by the scholastics. We're not here to air grievances, though. So what I want to get at is, I want to get at this. In a video that you once created, you were talking about Scotus's pantheism, and what you really meant was Scotus's panentheism. How through Scotus's work, in his theology, in his metaphysics, he really proposes a panentheistic metaphysics, a panentheistic metaphysical reality. This, I know, for people who are watching, for people who are casual readers of philosophy, casual readers of theology, individuals who just just the simple categorizations of things. And we're in the weeds in this conversation here. And what I'm really getting at is that it's difficult. It's good to categorize things, but you need to be careful because it can get very, very difficult if you are unaware or misguided, or you miscalculate the category. So going back, you categorize Scotus to be a panentheistic. This has to ruffle the feathers of many Christians, Eastern, Western, Protestant, for in the know Jews who are aware of Catholic or Christian theology. I'm sure this might ruffle their feathers as well, to even suggest that someone of the book is a panentheistic, or they are establishing a panentheistic metaphysics. Can you explain what you mean? Tie that together. How can you call someone a panentheist and a monotheist, specifically a monotheist of the book, at the same time?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a challenging question, and it's one which I'm grappling with all the time. both philosophically and personally. I think that what the monotheistic mystic is doing is something which is very subtle. And Scotus is a great example of this, but we could really pull out any name that's trying to reconcile the same thing, whether that's Eckhart
Yeah.
or Nachmanides, or from any tradition, Ibn Gabriel or Ibn Arabi. And I think that what they're trying to say is that there's a certain claim that's being made by the monotheist, which is that there's only one God, right?
Yeah.
And it's a denial of divine multiplicity. It's a denial of multiplicity within the divine and amongst other divinities. That's the basic claim of monotheism. Mono, theos, one God.
Yep.
The mystic within a monotheistic tradition is taking that claim and pulling it further, pulling it as far as it will go, pulling it to its furthest logical conclusion, which is that if there is only one God, right, and that one God is infinite, that means that there is nothing that is outside of that God. Because if there was something outside of it, that means that God would have a boundary and a border where it does not extend to, and it is finite, therefore. So if there is one God and that God is infinite, what you begin to subtly shade into, and not so subtly in the cases of Scotus and the thinkers we mentioned, is not just a form of monotheism, but a form of monism, that everything is one and that everything is God, right? You have to say, if you're saying that God is infinite, you have to say that everything is God. Those two propositions are natural bedmates. So what the Christian, Muslim, Jewish mystic will do is they'll take their Bible and they'll read phrases that are arguing for monotheism. And if you ask a biblical scholar, what is this text or verse trying to demonstrate? There's a verse in the 5 books of Moses. You should know this day and place it upon your heart that God is one, there's no other God beside him. So Ein od milvado, there's no other beside him. So I translated that mistakenly as there's no other God beside him, and I slipped in that word there. That word is not there in the Hebrew. Ein od, there's nothing else besides God, right? So for the monotheist, that means there are no other gods besides for God. For the mystic, for the monist, they're saying that there's nothing else at all besides for God, which means that when we encounter things, when we encounter the rest of reality, there's only one of two options. Either we're not actually seeing something, it's an illusion, right? And that is something that the mystics do discuss, both East and West.
Sure.
It's Maya for the Hindu, it's Helim for the Kabbalist, it's a dream for some Sufis. That is one option. But the option which I'm gravitating more towards, and I'm seeing in these more finer philosophical mystics, is that what we're encountering and experiencing is somehow a manifestation, a theophany, a revelation of God itself. And this is a point which Scotus makes constantly.
Yes.
That Scotus calls creation a theophany. It is a revelation of God. It is Deus revelatio, as opposed to Deus aspiconditus. That all of reality simply is the face of God. It is simply the names of God, as Ibn Arabi and Rumi put it.
Yeah.
So the shift from monotheist to monist is a tricky one, because it's both a logical necessity. I'm not saying it's the only logical possibility, but it's definitely a logical necessity, or a logical possibility, which some will see as necessary. But at the same time, it's one which radically challenges a standard monotheistic notion of God, if monotheism means that God is a third-party agent outside of the system. God is some sort of alien being who comes down and pops the world into being outside of him. And for the mystics, God is not a third-party entity. Right. God is reality itself, expressing itself into reality. And And Scotus and many others will distinguish between God as pre-manifest, God as manifest, the come to the radiation of that and the return to it. This is a classic Neoplatonic theme, which Scotus is reading from the great Christian mystics like Basil and Gregory of Nyssa and Pseudo-Dionysius, importantly, Maximus the Confessor, as well as Western thinkers like Augustine and Ambrose and Jerome and Macrobius and Boethius. But it's part of this great mystical revolution that goes through religions, that involves a complex dance and weaving between Gnosticism and Neoplatonism and Philo and Plotinus. It's a complex story, and the story which we're trying to spell out on the channel. But the basic point is that they move what they feel is naturally from their monotheism to a monism in ways that are really quite, I think, beautiful and radical, and they challenge a standard third-party form of monotheism.
Yeah, radical, definitely. That's a great, I mean, I think that's a great way of describing how you can categorize some of these mystical Christian thinkers into this monistic camp. And I love, I mean, and Scotus says this, and you bring this up, this multiplicity from unity, this exiting and coming back to Exodus and Reditus. And that's why I am a fan of, and I'm sure maybe you've encountered the work of Jonathan Pageau. And that's why I love, I mean, for me as a Christian, I think that's a great explanation of why we have the Trinity. It's this idea of multiplicity and unity, right? Constantly coming in and out of each other. And I think that's really important. And yeah, when you're doing something really challenging here. I mean, when you in the sense of interpreting Christian mystics here, or mystics across all traditions, it depends on how safe you want to be with your notion of God. As you put it, I love that, third party, right? What you're advocating for is there's no third party, there's no second party. There's just one party, and we're all
Correct.
at the party. And
Correct.
that's the beautiful thing of unity and multiplicity. And you know, you know the work of Pageau. He usually uses the idea of the cup, and how the cup is not, it's a cup, but the cup's a cup because there's a good that it has, and there's multiplicity of a cup, right? So like in my Starbucks cup, right, there's multiple things that actually make this up. And the beautiful thing, and why, in my opinion, life is inherently meaningful, to disagree with the nihilists, is because we are the players who are constantly making unity out of multiplicity, right? I'm staring at my computer. My computer is thousands of little parts, and of those parts, those are thousands of little more parts. And it's me who is able to, in nanoseconds, reconfigure my reality and look at all of these parts and make it into a unified, meaningful thing. Therefore, meaning is intrinsic in the human experience. You can't escape it because we're doing it right now. We do it with language, we do it with sight. All of our senses allow us to take multiplicity and bring it into one. Again, so therefore, life is intrinsically meaningful, and you can't escape it. And anyone who says that it's not is wrong. I'm hard pressed about that. So again, if we're to take a look at the cup, right, this idea of multiplicity and unity, I think about how we can take that notion and understand it, talking about humans and talking about biological living things. And I do think it's really beautiful. I believe that, going back to the earliest stages of our conversation, I believe that humans really are symbols of God's love. I think that in there's a fundamental sense that that's what we are. We are symbols of God's love. And I do think that together we need to kind of try to understand existence more in a unified way, because I think that really, if we would be cooking with fire here, to again use that phrase, if we just see each other as like multiple parts, right? We're just multiple different parts, and that's all we see. We look at humanity and we just understand the multiplicity of it, that, you know, there's Zebby, there's Joe, there's Jack, there's Gina, whatever. And we look at this in the religions, and there's this religion, that religion. But I wonder what the I wonder what the path would be, is if we were to take a step back, stand above, and try to realize that existence, yes, although we need to do the same thing that we're doing with the cup. So we need to be able to take a look at the multiplicity and bring it into a unity. And what that would look like if we can realize that maybe if there's a certain good that is bringing all humanity together, what that vision of a unified human, well, what that would look like, right? If we're to take a look at what would be like the unifying object, what would we look like as a unified object? Because I do think that if we're going to say that, life, maybe reality functions by taking multiplicity and making it unified, well, then we have to try to do that same thing with humanity. And I think the possibility of what it would look like if we realized the unification would be incredible, right? That would be like the highest functioning way of existing. I'm rambling. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, or if that.
No, I think this is the basic point that we're trying to get at, is that we can observe and analyze reality under two aspects. We can be looking for difference and differentiation, and there's place and there's time for that, and there's beauty in particularity and difference, certainly. And then we can also analyze reality as that which is united, that which we're connected in whether that's in anthropological ways that we share the human experience, or whether that's in metaphysical ways that we share a being, or whether that's in theological ways that we share the divine essence, however we want to frame it. And then to hold those together, really, I think that if we're just focusing on difference and differentiation, then there's no room for dialogue and for dance, for us all to live harmoniously on this tiny planet together. And if we're just focusing on unity, I think as well, sometimes that can slide into forms of homogeny and uniformity and totalitarianism. And I think that we need to hold those both together, right? Part of the unity is to find the unity between the unity and the multiplicity.
Yep.
And if we can have those two in a dance together, then I think that's the beauty of it. And I think that a lot of the work that we have to do as people who are raising our voices in some way or another, aided by the technologies of today, is to try and bring balance back to the pendulum. So if we're seeing too much unity, then I think we have to make a case for diversity and for multiplicity. If we're seeing too much difference and diversity and separation and otherness and bigotry, then we have to make a case for unity, which is why I'm taking up the work that I am, is because I think that we have to I think the swing needs to return, but it's certainly a matter of bringing the dance together. And I think that, like, it's so easy to get trapped in our tiny identities, we get lost. This is a point that a very non-mystic Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, makes. He says that we get lost. We think that we have a job and we do that from 9 to 5, and then someone asks us, "Who are you?" We say, "I am a waiter." Like it becomes he's like, it's not your essence. Your essence isn't. He doesn't believe that you have any essence, but we may say that no, like your essence is that you are a human. Like that's fore and foremost, before you're a male, before you're American or Japanese, before your nationality, before anything, you're a human. Like come back to the unity that you are, to the unity that unites you and that unites those around you. And I think that it's so, like, in the contemporary world that we live in, we need to be able to pull ourselves out and see things from a bit of a bird's eye view and be like, what are we doing?
Yes.
How are we living our lives?
Right.
And I think it's a form of insanity. Can you imagine, like, if you saw someone in the street that was like stabbing their left arm, you would like grab them and institutionalize them, right?
What are you doing? Yeah.
But then we look at humanity, which is one. We're one body here on this one planet, united in radical ways, and we're stabbing ourselves, and it's a form of insanity. And I think when the mystic sees that, it's like how can you live in that reality? How can you live in a reality where part of you, the other human, is on the street starving and hungry? It's like that's a reality that you can't be living in. And if you're serious about your theology, and you're seeing the divine manifest in the human, if you're serious about your pantheism or panentheism, and you're seeing all as divine, you should it should bother you. And I think that is the case that we're making here.
And that's why I want to go back to that Trinitarian notion of God. And I know obviously we would disagree on this, but that's why for my life, that's why it makes sense. It makes sense. And how it makes sense and why I'm bringing this back up is something that you said. I totally agree. It cannot just be we can't just be this like glob of unified things without differentiation, right? Because again, I
Right.
love that you said that's how we get totalitarianism, that's how we get tyrannical rule. That's true, and that's why I personally reject the Buddhist project, right? I do think there is a, they would say there's no difference between me and you, right? The only thing that differentiates us is our ego. The fact that I believe that there's a Joe, a different from a Zevi, and I do disagree with that. So you need multiplicity, and that's why going back to Scotus, it's a constant exiting and returning, right? So keeping one hand on the unity, keeping one hand on the multiplicity. Again, that's why I really like that. That's why for me the Trinity is such a great symbol, or such a great way of, when I say symbol, I mean I'm just to like draw it out, but such a great way of perceiving and understanding God. It is this, this we've used the word dance a lot, this dance between multiplicity and unity. And for me, it really makes sense to understand God that way. And I think that obviously I know this much about mysticism compared to you, but I would say that's the mystics project, right? Would you agree with me when the whole spiel I just went on talking about multiplicity and unity, and trying to take the multiplicity and the unity would be, we need to unify under God, whether you want to, well, God, I'll just say that. I think that is part of the mystics project. Am I wrong about that, or?
No, I think you're certainly right about it, and I think it's a good way of putting it. I would want to again expand the category a bit broader, and I would want to say that one can be finding unity, and the unity in multiplicity, without a notion of God. I think God is. It's important not to mistake the map with the terrain, or the finger pointing at the moon with the moon itself. I think that when a word like God is a human word, a human language, a human concept, and it is a map.
Particular
It is
schema.
it is a finger point. Yeah, it's a schema, exactly. It's a finger pointing at the moon, and the moon, or the terrain, is reality itself. It is the Ding an sich, as Kant may call it. It is the numinous itself. And I think that using God is one map, is one scheme, is one way of getting there, is one signifier. But I think that one can be a very good mystic without using that particular map. And I think Buddhism is one example of that. And there are other forms of that. So for some people, it's multiple gods. And I don't want to put any of those down. I think like this. When I grew up,
You're more careful about that than I am.
I'll tell you why.
I like that. That's good. I mean, that's why we're having a rich conversation.
Yeah, and I'm happy also to disagree about this with people. I'm not always looking to. Jews are very famous for loving disagreement. We see disagreement in good faith as a sacred act, right? There's a phrase in the Talmud which is machloket l'shem shamayim, which is disagreement for the sake of heaven, for the sake of the divine. So there's nothing wrong with disagreeing. On the contrary, it's a rather holy thing to do when it's done in good faith, between people that care about each other. I think that I grew up in a very, very traditional, conservative, maybe even fundamentalist form of Judaism, and I'm very grateful that I had that upraising, and it was very beautiful and very nurturing and very warm. But what I was taught theologically, as a child, and I can only speak to my own experience and education, was that we are right and they are wrong. And they is everyone else. It is the atheist, it is the Buddhist, it is the Muslim, it is the Christian. And there was a sense of even mock and ridicule, like, sure, oh, this thing which they call a mystery or a paradox is just nonsense, and it's illogical. And unfortunately, there are still, to be upfront about it, there are still active voices within the Orthodox Jewish community that will speak about other religions that way. And I think I don't appreciate those voices. I now, in retrospect, think that approach is wrong. And from where I stand now, and I'm still growing and I'm still learning and I'm still making mistakes, but from where I stand, I can say that all of our attempts to gesticulate towards reality itself are merely attempts. They're human attempts to grasp the ineffable mystery of reality itself. And if, for the Christian, the way which they attempt to map out that mystery is through the symbolism of a Trinitarian Godhead, it is through a complex understanding that is self-definitionally paradoxical and not humanly understandable of three that are one and not one. And for them, that is if it is an effective form for them to gesture towards the reality of being and the dance between multiplicity and unity that we strive for, and one which makes them into kinder, better, caring people, better spouses and parents, better neighbors and friends, better caring, concerned citizens for the world, then good. And what they're doing is true. Is true because it is true for them. It is a true, and by true I mean it is an accurate map representing reality in a way that's allowing them to live as paragons of someone who is in touch with reality, which for me is in kindness, in compassion, in understanding, in care. If someone has a perfect orthodox theology of any faith, but it's making them because of their theology or whatever it is, it's making them into angry, mean, vindictive, heartless people, then their orthodox theology, as orthodox it is wrong, and it's not working. It's not true. So for me, I'm looking at truth here from a bit more of a Jamesian or a pragmatistic standpoint. And from where I stand now, I can look at another theology. I can look at the Buddhist who has no God, but who is inspired by their own metaphysics, their own theories of unity, to live more unified kind of lives. And I'm perfectly happy with that as well. And I'm not looking to discredit or to discount or to disprove, and I don't need to. And I don't need my faith isn't any stronger because someone else also has an accurate road sign that's bringing them into reconciliation with reality and allowing them to live in accordance with the principles of love and reality itself.
There's a lot to metabolize, man. So yeah, I mean, it's walking away from this conversation. I'm definitely going to do a lot of thinking. It's just so damn difficult to like grasp, because again, I'm even like now thinking of the first parts of our conversation, and I don't know how to reconcile everything that we've talked about, because I'm thinking about this a little fragmented. It's like we talked about this theistic notion of God. We talked about pluralism. We talked about relativism a little bit. We talked about how we need religiosity and capital R religion. And it's just very difficult to reconcile all these things, because when you're talking, there's part of me that's saying, Joe, oh, you agree very much with Zevi. And there's another part of me that's like, Joe, you very much disagree with Zevi.
Good.
And yeah, right, exactly. And the reason is just because it's a difficult reconciliation to make, right? So, you bring up this very beautiful landscape of what, well, you just bring up this really beautiful landscape of how people can go about their mysticism, or how they can achieve a more mystical way of approaching reality. And that's great. But then, there are some things I'm hearing that sounds a little pluralistic. That sounds a little relativistic. It's just very hard to reconcile. It's just very hard to reconcile. It's very hard to call yourself a Jew or a Catholic and not advocate for, well, I guess for us, right, the way of the book. And so, and even more so because you do have very important mystics of the book. You have the Jewish mystics, you have the Christian mystics, you have the Muslim mystics. And I know you don't want to contextualize mysticism under the banner of any one religion, right? I understand that. It's just very difficult not to, because then I don't know how you end up getting I don't know how you end up not producing a metaphysics of pluralism or a metaphysics of relativity. Very difficult for me, and I'm sure you probably struggle with this as well from time to time.
Yeah, I'm glad that it's difficult. I think these conversations are challenging, and they're challenging for me and for you and for us. And I'm glad that we're both agreeing and disagreeing. And I also want to say that I don't think that I'm speaking the truth. I think that I'm speaking what I find to be most persuasive and convincing for me in this moment. with a lot of research and thinking and rethinking.
Yeah.
And when I have real conversations where there's disagreement, and I'm left rethinking my own beliefs, I find those to be beautiful moments. Maybe let's frame it like this. And you could call this a form of relativism, perhaps, but I don't think it is entirely. I've given up perhaps on the project of discovering the truth. I think there's a lot of hubris in saying that I know what the truth is. I think that knowing the truth necessitates, philosophically, metaphysically, some point of anchor outside of my own reality from which I can verify that I have the truth that is not tainted by my own subjectivity, right? For philosophical point, I don't know whether I'm awake or dreaming right now. And I may wake up and this could be a dream. And I have many podcast conversations. So it wouldn't be a strange content for dream. I don't know. I really don't know a good philosophical way to prove that this is not in my head, which means I don't have an anchor. I don't have a fulcrum point outside of the universe, outside of my own reality. And I think that the problem with a lot of metaphysics is that a lot of metaphysics, because it's predicated on a third-party God, believe that they do have a fulcrum outside of the system, which is God, which is their point of truth and a point of absolute truth from which they can adjudicate right and wrong. And it's a very important one. It's very central to Western theology and philosophy. I'm working from the assumption. I started off in the very beginning saying that I'm not trying to make any metaphysical claims or claims about the nature of reality. I'm talking about human experiences, because as far as I know, that's all I have access to is my human experiences and the human experience of others. I think I have a bit more of a sophisticated point, which is that I think that we have to ultimately deconstruct the binary between objective and subjective, and sort of move into a place of transsubjectivity, but that we could get to that perhaps. But the point that I'm trying to say is that before we do anything fancy like that epistemologically, I think a basic starting point is, at least for me, is that I'm not making claims here about revelation. I'm not saying that some God, some entity from outside the system came and spoke to one particular people and told them the truth is that the nature of God is X, Y, and Z. Even if that happened, right, under my contemporary epistemology from where I stand, I wouldn't necessarily know how to differentiate that from my own firsthand experience, and therefore be forced to interpret that through my own experience. I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to look at what are the surest of human experiences. This is a very basic point. When we try to make meaning out of anything, right? We take a text. The text is confusing. We have parts of the text that we have a bit of a better grasp on and parts that we don't have a better grasp on. We take the parts that we understand a bit better, and from them we extrapolate on the ones that we don't understand. This is a classic principle in any hermeneutics, very important in biblical hermeneutics, that we take what is clear and obvious to us, and then from that we make sense of that which is convoluted and unsure to us.
Right.
So when we look at human experience, there's a lot of experience. What is typical of the mystical experience is a term which John Vervaeke and others use, which is that it has a characteristic of ontonormativity. William James, in his great book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, calls one of the four characteristics of mysticism that is noetic, that it comes with a sense of, wow, this is an experience of reality, which is more true than my waking, everyday, ordinary experience. And what we do is, what the mystics do is, they try then to explain their everyday reality based on the clarity which they experience in their mystical experience. And I think that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to start at a very human place. I'm not making metaphysical claims. I'm not making truth claims. I'm not making religious claims. I'm saying, what is it that humans are experiencing, have experienced out of history? How can we make sense of those with the best science and philosophy available to us? What are the theories that we may employ to try and understand them, and to remember that they're only just theories, and at some point we have to make choices. We have moral convictions.
I do believe it's the reason why you're still go on.
Not just compromise. I think we have to make choices. We have to make convictions. We have to have affirmations. The covenant means that I'm choosing to believe in this thing, whether I know it to be true or not. In Judaism, we enter the covenant with God at the age of 9 before the child can, sorry, at the age, what am I saying? At the age of 8 days old, we circumcise a male child, which means that it's before we can know anything, before we can even conceptualize any syllogism
I
or
hope you weren't 9.
proposition. Yeah, not 9. And this is a very important point. And I think that that and I hope others make a commitment that violence, that hatred, that callousness, that jealousy, that these are things that we want to avoid.
Yeah.
And that kindness, understanding, compassion, empathy, these are things we want to embrace. And when we establish, and it may be a bit of a reverse metaphysic, we establish what is our end goal. Our end goal is goodness and kindness, and then we can ask, are the theories that we're using to make sense of our experiences, which feel more real than our ordinary experiences, are they coherent and consistent with where they're ending up? Because there are mystics, by the way, who are very terrible people. There's a lot of occult and mystical influences amongst the Nazis. There's the whole camp of traditionalists, people like Julius Evola, who tie power and fascism into their mysticism, and they do terrible things with it. So I'm trying to take a step back here. What I'm trying to say is, and I know this may be a bit all over the place, and it's me trying to get at what's in my head. What I'm trying to say is that thank you. I'm not starting with any religious claim. I'm not claiming there is a God and God exists. I'm not claiming that Judaism is right, or I'm not making any orthodox claim.
No.
I'm saying what is it that we humans are experiencing? What can we extrapolate from these experiences? And I do think that we can bridge our own subjectivity by finding other humans who are having that experience and drawing those parallels and being careful about that, being systematic and methodological to reach something which is transsubjective in our understanding. Is it relative? I don't think so. Is it absolutist? I don't think so. I think it's somewhere in between that. I think it's transsubjective.
I like that term.
Yeah.
Man, that was good, Zevi. I understand what you mean. And well, I think I have an understanding of what you mean. I used to sometimes when I was trying to, actually, you know what, before I get to that point, let me explain. I said the word compromise, and I was going to say, yeah, you compromise, and the compromise is you deciding that you're going to continue to be a Jew. But I like how you said, no, it's not a compromise, it's a choice. And so I really appreciated that, because for me, yeah, I was thinking more, I'm compromising because if you have this vision of well, given your project, given what your beliefs are, given your beliefs of the transsubjective, yeah, I thought, okay, well, you're going to compromise, knowing that there are experiences, knowing that humans share subjective but also shared phenomena. We're making the compromise to just pick. I thought maybe you were trying to state that you're making the compromise, knowing all this, that you're just picking, you're choosing, you're compromising to be Jewish. And I like how I appreciate how you differentiated. That no, compromise would say that. I think compromise kind of has more of like a relativistic connotation,
right? Where
choice has a more objective connotation. So to mix everything up even more, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate that you appreciate it, and I certainly wouldn't say that my Judaism is a compromise. I think it's choice. I think it's who I am. I think it's I don't compromise to be a male, even though that I realize that I'm a human more fundamentally than I am a male. But I choose to express as such, and it's the same way that my masculinity, or the same way that my malehood rather perhaps, is part of my genetics, is part of how I'm born. I'm born a Jew, and that's my spiritual genetics, right? It's not a compromise as such. I think a metaphor which is helpful sometimes is when we think about language, right? Like there are people who do believe in an essentialistic version of language, and this is typical actually amongst many mystics, that they believe that there's holy language, and holy language means that the language is not arbitrary, it's essential, it's ontological, it's divine, it's not just descriptive, it's prescriptive, it's formative. But in contemporary linguistics, and in the world that we live in, people understand, ever since Saussure and others, people understand or have come to understand that language is arbitrary, right? That I call this a bottle, but there's no ontological connection between the syllables and the sound that comes out of my mouth and what I'm holding in my hand.
Yeah.
And I could call this a cup, and that would be fine too, as long as people understand it's conventional language. I think that on those grounds, right? So there are people who do claim that language is essential, and those people, I think, line up and actually both conceptually and in reality often with a claim that religion is essential, that my religion is the truth and my religion is the reality, and it is the metaphysical grounding, and it is my God, not your God. Then there are people who don't believe there should be any religion at all, and that we should all be doing some sort of wishy-washy universalism, or embrace some sort of modern technocratic, utopian, whatever form of atheism it is. And that's like people saying, oh, we need to be like beyond language at all. And I think that what I'm saying is that we need language. We need to understand that language is human constructs. Sometimes we need to believe that it's not, and that's an important, like, sort of, that's a tricky epistemological thing to do, to believe in the myth even though you know it's a myth.
Yeah.
But to have my language and to be proud of my language, and sometimes multiple languages, right? I speak 3 languages, and each one of them does different things for me. I can express myself poetically in other ways and conceptualize reality in other ways. But also, what I'm trying to do through Seekers of Unity is to articulate a new language of religion, which is akin to what the Polish optometrist Zamenhof tried to do with his creation of Esperanto, that he saw that there was a lot of conflict and war between religions. It was, the time of the Great World Wars, and he felt that that language was the barrier between us, and if we could only all understand each other, then we could have world peace. And so he created this very, very basic Esperanto, which was kind of this middle ground of Western languages. But the point is not that all the world should speak Esperanto. If the entire world was speaking Esperanto, right, that would be the greatest linguistic tragedy that we could ever conceptualize. If all poetry and all literature and all love and all novels and all theater and all discourse and all conceptions of reality was shrunk into one tiny thin language, that would be horrendous.
Yep. It goes back to that multiplicity and unity idea.
Yes. So when people talk about a relativism, I think what they're thinking about is this form of just this one thin wishy-washy thing that everyone does that doesn't really mean anything, but it's just enough that we can all get by on. And that's not what I want to see. I want to see the same way that Zamenhof wanted to see the Spanish speaking Spanish proudly, and the English speaking English finely, and the Chinese speaking Chinese beautifully. I want to see Muslims being the best, most devout Muslims, connected to their own lineage, their own tariqah, and to the Prophet Muhammad and to the Quran the most deeply possible. I want to see the Christian fully in love with Jesus and fully connected to their own version of Christianity, whether that's through the Mother Mary, or through the saints and prophets, or whether that's directly to the text of the Bible and to the great Reformation theologians. I want them to be the best Christians that they can be. But on top of all of that, to have a shared common religious narrative, the religious version of Esperanto, which is the recognition that at our core, we're all attempting to communicate with reality itself, to be in communion with reality. And that is the common language. And that is the transsubjective. And that is that which unites us. And it's not a compromise.
Right?
The shared cognition, the shared appreciation, the shared experience, the shared form to articulate those things. I want to be able to have a spiritual experience. I want to be able to have an experience where I can talk with the Christian, and he can express, or she can express, her experience of the dark night of the soul, and I can talk about my own experience of Katan Sameichin, and know that we're talking about the same phenomena from 2 different linguistic and cultural and religious backgrounds. Sure. So it's not even a compromise. I don't want people to be compromising to speak their own language, to be their own religious. I want them to be fully Buddhist, fully Christian, fully. If someone's an atheist, I want them to be fully atheistic and fully proud of the heritage of modernity and science, and to be connected by this common thread of mysticism, which I think is available to the atheist, to the religionist, to the mystic, to the Christian, to the Jew, equally. That's what I'm trying to get at.
That's good. That's good, man. Yeah, you do a great job. I mean, you are very talented at summarizing and paraphrasing. We won't get into this because I know it's so funny. I call this the gist with Joe because the gist is supposed to be like a 45-minute conversation. But here's the deal. Maybe talking about mysticism and how we perceive reality and different perceptions of metaphysics. Maybe the gist sometimes has to be a long time. And this is a beautiful conversation. I don't want to wrap it up just quite yet, but I do want to start to descent. Um, and man, we need to have more conversations because again, I do disagree. I don't necessarily want a bunch of atheists being the best atheists out there, but but here's the deal. I you approach it in such a caring way, which is truly the good, right? Like if the good is to will to will, well, like no, you really like love. I mean, you come into this lovingly, because if love is to will the good of the other without any selfish regard, that's what you're doing. So when you say that you want the atheist to be the best atheist, I would disagree by saying, well, I think maybe in my opinion, a higher functioning form of love would be, bringing those people to Christ, or, I mean, hell, just for this conversation, bringing them to the book. Um, but I don't even want to talk about that right now. I just want to let you know that you approach this very caringly and very lovingly. And I very much sincerely appreciate that. I think that
Thank you,
that's
brother.
good. I really do think that's good.
I really appreciate that. It's really good to be reminded of that, because sometimes when you're like caught up in like hours and hours of research and writing and editing, and like you can forget that it's like a love that drives you into it. And then when I stop myself and ask myself, like, why am I doing it? It is because of the love that is what drives it. And I think ultimately that's what drives all of us. So I very much appreciate you firstly seeing it, and secondly observing it. And again, like I'm really glad to be in both agreement and disagreement with you. I'm not even looking here to make everyone think like me and persuade. I want to hear your disagreement as much as I want to express my own point of view. And to me, that's a beautiful thing. It's not a matter of yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. I The second point that I wanted to get to, maybe this can be like one of the last in-depth things that we discuss. Um, I used to, okay, when I was a high school teacher, it's very hard. This is one of the things that my wife and I are trying to figure out, that I want to have conversations with other people about, is how do you raise a kid now to be a symbolic thinker, to be a thinker of patterns, to see patterns? How do you raise someone to be enthralled by the mystic ethos when when we literally just operate under a well, we just operate materialistically. I mean, we're
Right.
just material. We're materialists. That's literally
Right.
how we perceive reality.
Right.
Reality is all objective. I, I don't even know how I'm gonna how I'm about to raise my son to make sure that he doesn't do that. So that's probably when I talk about what's my gist. That's my project, is making sure that my son is not a materialist. Um, he can't be. He can't be. We named him Dante after Dante, and
Wow.
um,
That's beautiful.
so he would be leaving his name in vain if he was
Right.
just a scientist, a materialist.
Right.
Anyway, I get that. My preamble. Um, my preamble to say, when I was working with 16 and 17-year-olds, their whole worldview is scientism and materialism, without them even knowing that those are
Right.
words, that those are the
Right.
frameworks in which they operate
Right.
under. And I would have to explain to them again. I'll bring for the third time. I'll bring up Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. I read when I read The Fellowship, or a lot of kids just don't read anymore. So I said, when you watch The Fellowship, do you ever go away huffing and puffing, like your heart's beating fast after the movie ends, or maybe like at the very end, at the Return of the King, right? You're just like because you're just like, what did I experience? Like, what did I just witness? This is great. I'm invigorated. I feel awesome. I have chills starting from my eyebrows all the way down to my toes because I feel this vibration and it feels good and I feel alive and I feel like I want to do something.
Mm.
And when we look at art, when we watch a good movie, when we finish a good book, when we read a good poem, it inspires us, right? It inspires us to do more. It makes us out of breath. It gives us tingles. And my point is like that's more realer than you going to school and just sitting through a class and then you being on your phone at night and then going to bed. It's like that is technically not materialistically real, but it's so real. It makes you inspired. It makes you perceive reality differently. That's more realer than real. And I would explain to the kids that, and they would, for those who it only worked for the individuals, mostly the young girls, because they're really the ones in high school who are more attuned to liking literature, liking art. But that snapped them out of it for a second, and they realized, oh, there could be a reality outside, or there could be a more real reality nested in our objective reality. And so I'm connecting that to what you said before. Like that's that you want to like that you're trying to connect. You're trying to connect and remember that there is a reality nested within a reality and that it is expressed in multiple different traditions. And you're trying to find what I'm thinking you're doing is you're trying to find the through line, right? Again, I use tapestry. Where you're trying to weave the tapestry, and the thread is what have humans been able to contextualize that makes them feel realer than real? Am I correct about that?
Yeah, that's definitely a way that I would put it, and I appreciate the articulation of that. It's there's like these are really important questions, and I think that it's like it's important to be careful about how we speak about them. I think two thoughts come to mind in listening to you, and I'm trying to listen. I think listening is also a lost art these days. I think that we have to be careful when picking our boogeymen. And it's okay to have them. We just have to be careful and really careful in how we pick them. And then the question of, well, then what is it that we are aiming for, right? What are we trying to get away from, and what are we trying to aim towards? And you can correct me if I heard you wrong, but what you're articulating is we're trying to get away from materialism, from objectivism, and we're trying to get towards the realer real.
Not that we're necessarily trying to reject all materialism and objectivism altogether, but again, it's that trying to find that middle space.
Yeah. Okay, so that is a more careful way of putting it. I mean, I do have some observations to make. If were you trying to lead up to us to a later point, or is this, or would you like me to respond to what you've said just now?
You can just respond to this. I mean, obviously there's more, but there's always more.
I think like this. I think that I think firstly, we never I don't have children myself at the moment, but I think part of the challenge of parenting is that we bring our children into the world, but they're ultimately going to be their own people, and they're going to decide for themselves who they are. I think one of the great morals of the sacrifice of Isaac is God telling Abraham that you do not own your child. Your child is not yours to define you. You have to bring up your child on an altar which is higher than you and higher than what you think as well. And your child will find their own gods. And that's an important part of the Jewish tradition.
They will leave their mother and father. You will leave your mother and father behind.
Yeah. That's a very difficult thing from what I hear. As I'm saying, I'm not a father, but from what I hear, it's a very difficult thing. And I'm sure it's difficult for my father, for myself and siblings, each of us exploring our own paths. And I feel a lot of love and acceptance from them to do so. I think I just wanted to say one thing about materialism and then one thing about realness. Materialism, I think, does become the boogeyman, and I think that it's important to distinguish materialism from how that term is used colloquially and philosophically. So materialism colloquially is the notion that we can satisfy our cravings in life and our desires in life through material possession and consumption, and that's a core of our identity. Materialism philosophically is related to that, but different. Materialism philosophically is the belief that what is fundamental to reality, or what is the only thing in existence, those are two versions of materialism, is matter itself, and is the negation of the immaterial, right? It's a very complex point amongst theologians and philosophers. Theology typically wants to argue, of course, for the immaterial, for spirit, for soul, for divinity. These are immaterial constructs. Even consciousness is something which is contentious now in that space. And if we're rejecting the first version of materialism, that we're going to be happy if we have a Lamborghini, or if we have, the next the fanciest watch, obviously that's a form which I want to be rejecting. I do think
that's what you need to do first, in my opinion. You need to do that first with well, in the example that we're talking about with the kids, or even with us, with people. You're not going to be able to approach that philosophically, or even be able to nuance this philosophically and say, no, they're actually, philosophical materialism actually is not the boogeyman. However, no one's approaching it like that first. You have to give them the practical, colloquial, as you put it, reasons why materialism is not good, before you can even approach the philosophical. So yeah, in my explanation of the movie and how that's more realer than real, yeah, that's an attempt to destroy or deconstruct the first colloquial notion of materialism.
Right.
Again, you're never going to get there unless you do that first.
Right. Okay. So I'm glad that we're clarifying the point here. The point which I just want to say is that there are very rich forms, and I'm not gonna unpack this because it will take too long, but we'll just drop it here and then we can come back to another time. Yeah. There are very, very beautiful and sophisticated forms of mystical materialism in a philosophical sense, not in a cultural sense. And I think of people like people as diverse as Pierre de Chardin-Teilhard, who speaks about embracing the ocean of matter, for it is that from which we were born and that to which we shall return. And there's a divinization of matter in Hasidic mysticism, in late forms of Zen and Mahayana Buddhism. So that I just want to drop that in there, just
You're
to
a careful guy.
Yeah,
I tried to categorize you so many times in this conversation, and you said, "Well, let's not." Or that's what I do. I mean, I think for better and for worse, I categorize. And
well, we have to.
I like that you're just like, Joe. Let's reframe. Let's reframe.
I hope that I'm not. I hope that I'm not coming across as difficult or
coming across as caring and measured.
Thank you. So the other point in which I wanted to, and this is actually something that I was just thinking about in bed last night, and it's on my head now, which is why I want to say this.
Sure.
In terms of what is the really real, when we come out of a great work of art or literature, and we feel inspired about reality, we feel turned on, we feel that we see hope, we see possibility, we feel charged to do something. That sense of realness, I think is a super important one, a super important driver. And I think that it's I think that shades very, very comfortably into the mystical, to the sense of the realness that we encounter in mysticism. There's a great philosophical exploration of this done by an English philosopher by the name of Colin Wilson, who I absolutely love. It's a theme that Colin Wilson. It's a theme which he explored throughout his life. In his very first famous book, which is The Outsiders, and then later Man and the Machine, it's a theme which he explored throughout his life. He wrote many books, and basically what Wilson is looking at the great. He's such a beautiful character and such a beautiful friend to encounter in literature, and I recommend him. He's talking about the great figures from poetry and art and history, and looking at their moments of aliveness. Right, he looks at someone like Van Gogh, who paints the starry sky, this work which is bursting with life and creativity and imagination and complexity. And then the Van Gogh who is depressed and suicidal, and
Man,
he's looking at these great characters who go on these journeys through the highs of what feels to him to be the realest real, and then the lowest lows, and he wants to know which one of those two are real. Is it Van Gogh's depression or his Starry Night? Which one is the real?
interesting.
And he has his own very fascinating conclusions about that, and they're worth exploring. And he reads that as part of a mystical phenomenological project, existential project. It's very fascinating. What I want to take out from Wilson and from my own experience, and this is something which I'm learning myself, through the years, maturing slowly, which is that there is certainly this pursuit of realness, and we're looking for realness in that which is passionate and alive and driven and on fire. We want to be on fire, and we don't want to be depressed and down and uninspired and unmotivated. And that definitely plays into the conversation of mysticism and existentialism. What I want to present, what I'm thinking lately is that sometimes the pursuit of realness, and I'm not denying what you're saying. I think it's so important and so beautiful, and I'm a romanticist at heart as well, and I agree with the sentiment. But I think that sometimes when we place too many eggs in the basket of enthusiasm and passion, we're striving for something which is transient, which is elusive, and when that moment leaves us, we can be left cold and dry. And there's something of a Buddhist argument here, which is that instead of trying to pursue the highest heights and run away from the deepest deeps, we can try and find equilibrium. We can try and find a place where we're not ecstatic and we're not depressed, but we're content. And I've been having like a rough week or two, and I was feeling kind of depressed after a period of being quite elated. And I kind of can go through these kind of manic extended phases and then sort of depressed phases. I'm not using these terms clinically. I think these are part of the human experience.
Yes.
And what I'm working on now is trying to strive for contentment and trying to strive for, like, I was lying in bed last night and I wasn't particularly elated, but I wasn't sad either. I just came back from a very meaningful and honest conversation with a friend, a difficult conversation. And I felt a realness while I was lying there that was not ecstatic, and that I wasn't burning with passion and enthusiasm. It was just simply a realness where I felt the presence of myself, the things around me. And there was a realness there, which was, it felt more mature and less volatile than the excitement that I was chasing, earlier. And I still chase. And I just wanted to add that to the conversation, because I think for mental health, I think particularly for teenagers and youth, I think it's important to know that we don't, even within the world of the mystics, and I can bring case examples from the mystics where it's not necessarily about chasing the peaks. The mystics aren't chasing mystical experiences. They're chasing the real, they're chasing the divine. And sometimes the real is just comfortable and is just a state of equanimity and is just a state of the great Christian mystic who said, all is well and all shall be well, that it's things are okay. And that can be very real. And that could be as real, if not realer, than moments of ecstasy.
No, that's good. I'm really happy that you brought that up, because I think people new to this conversation of mysticism, new to this conversation of religion, new to your channel, new to my channel, whatever. Sometimes you think of mystical, capital M, mystical experience. This goes back to the psychedelic thing that we were talking about. Like, this is a mystical experience, right? This was a
Right.
capital M, one time only,
Right.
or like one time, or the next week it's going to be one time. It's like fragmented one-time, experiences. And what it sounds like you're advocating for, and I wrote this down, is like, you're advocating for mysticism. I don't even know why I put that. Mysticism in the sense of, being in union with the reality is not an experience, but a mode of being.
Yes, 100%.
It's a mode of being. It's a mode of existence. And yeah, I like that you brought up the mental health, because as I shared this with you earlier, as someone who is in the stages of becoming a mental health clinician, this is obviously something that I want to reframe and help my future patients, clients realize that, yeah, I mean, the existentialists could say this, in the theory that they create of counseling, is that, yeah, depression, anxiety, Rollo May will say this, that anxiety is just, it's part of the natural mode of being, and you have to deal with it. And
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah, realer than real might not always be the that was awesome, right? It might not be the ecstatic. It might just be you might feel frozen. You might feel down. Realizing that mysticism is not just about positive emotions, that
Yes.
maybe it could also be about negative or neutral
Yes.
emotions. Am I right
Yes.
about that, you think?
Yes. 100%.
Yeah.
100%. And I think this is, I'm not just talking from a place of like 21st century kind of woke psychology. I'm talking from the literature of the mystics. And if some, like, if we have time to take this up, and if someone wants to take it up with me, like I can bring like source after source of ancient, medieval, modern mystics of from the Jewish tradition, from other traditions. This is such an important point. It's not the mystics really, it's a modern conception that emerges in the 18th and 19th century, and that's exemplified and is really exemplified by James, where it's this chase for ecstasy and for experience, and the mystics really don't care about that. They care about reality itself, which they call God, and they care about, I really loved how you put it, that it's a mode of being which they're after. It's a mode of being which is in union with reality, and it's not about of course ecstasy is part of that, because ecstasy is part of the human experience, and depression is part of that, because depression is part of the human experience. The mystic has the dark night of the soul, which is their version of a spiritual depression. The mystic has their moments of ecstasy, but more importantly, it is a mode of being. It's not about states of mind. It's about traits. It's about transforming our modes of being to be receptive to reality, to be open to reality, to be in love with reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the reason why so many people have that image, and I think about like probably the most artistically renderation of mysticism in the Catholic tradition would have to be the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. If you know that work by Bernini, the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, that's the most like famous sculpture, and there's obviously other renditions of it, but I think the word ecstasy, I mean, the modern contemporary person will either think of ecstasy as like the drug, and then the euphoric feelings from the drug, right, or they think of like sexual satisfaction, the ecstasy of having sex. And then you look at then that's why Bernini does a great job. I mean, Bernini, that was a man who was just able to capture really like the physical emotions of humanity through marble. Truly a prophet in his own right. But you look at that rendition, and it's the ecstasy. I mean, Saint Teresa is being pierced. That's what it looks like. It's a piercing, and there's like calamity on her face. It's not good. It doesn't feel good, right? And I think that's a great way of trying to think of like, yeah, this mystical mode of being. And again, just another way to frame what we're discussing is that, yeah, it's not all pleasurable. But when I say that, there's pleasure in the unpleasurable at the same time.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Yes, no, it's a subtle point which you're trying to get across, but it's one with which I resonate with, which is that, and this is a point that the Eastern mystics make very beautifully, and that the Kabbalists make as well. Thinking now that the fundamental nature of reality, in some sense, I'm not saying this is what they're saying, is awareness, consciousness, bliss. For the Kabbalists, they describe as the fundamental or primary manifestation of the divine Keter as a state of desire and will, and a state of tainug, a state of pleasure, which is not, and it can mean pleasure as we make it out to mean ecstasy, because it also just means that fundamentally being itself is like a beautiful thing, and it's a pleasurable thing, and it's not a pleasure in terms of like a pleasure that's part of some sort of arousal and then descent. It's just like the state of reality. If we could just like let go of our fears and concerns and problems for a moment, we would just feel there's this sort of baseline bliss that underlies reality, and it's not like a running, pumping, like it's not an exciting bliss. It's just is like just the bliss of being, and I think that's the great equanimity which they're after. And yeah, it's funny because ecstasy, the etymology is literally ecstasis, to be outside oneself, to and which is what it means in the Greek context, that one has an outer body experience
Yeah.
and it transcends from themselves. And I think we have to, like, it's a clunky word, but we have to try and introduce something like instacy, of like no, like don't run away from your situation, don't run away from yourself, like be so deeply in yourself, like that you can feel like the homeostasis of your body, you can feel like the bliss that is in your being, um which is also, I think, a fundamental point of Christianity, like this notion that comes out of the Gospels themselves, that God is love, that like God, i.e. reality, is a state of lovingness, is a state of bliss, is a state of peace. And it's and I think this formulation is really, really critical, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation.
Yeah, and I just want to just say one thing. You talked about God is love, and how, i.e. God is reality. And again, piecing this together, saying that you not every mystical experience is pleasure and pleasure. It's either not every mystical experience has to be aesthetic in the way that we think of it. And yeah, I go back and I think about even again, I don't want to, I'm probably going to misstep here because I'm not a great thinker in Old Testament thought, but even like even the way that God is characterized in the Old Testament, right? It's not always love in the sense of pleasure. Sometimes it's love in the sense of pain, or in the sense of retribution, in the sense of punishment. And yeah, we need to be more attuned to that, because there is such thing as love in displeasure. And yeah, I think the Mystical Project, and I hope that people realize that, yeah, the Mystical Project is trying to understand a reality that both that has both pleasure and pain in it, and that those are good things to experience. And I'm really happy for you that you had that realization. I mean, and I think a lot of people, I don't think that what you're saying is completely unique. I think that in the personal is the universal. And I think many people have thought this before, but again, going back to a more of like a mental healthy aspect of this, is that people like to run away from those negative or just
Yeah,
not always positive feelings.
yeah, yeah.
And that's a real problem. Um, and moving forward, I mean, if you ever want to have another conversation, I would love to have I would love to have. There's a lot to have There's a lot to have multiple conversations about. I would love to, if you would ever want to even talk about this idea of pleasure and pain, or pleasure and pain in context of mysticism, in context to even mental health, how a mystic mode of being might be a good, not remedy, because I don't like to like throw like a panacea on it, but a good intervention, maybe is the right word, a good intervention to alleviate maybe some presenting mental health concerns. I think that would be like a cool conversation, and cool work that we could do later. Also, didn't really get to it today. Love to talk more if you're ever willing to talk about St. Ignatius of Loyola. Really, one of my favorite mystical thinkers, and someone who's really overlooked as a mystical thinker. I was trained by the Jesuits. I went to a Jesuitly sponsored university, and I have a lot of passion and a lot of respect for Jesuit thought. It's hard to say that as a Catholic, because in the United States, and really throughout the world, whenever you say that you're a Jesuit, they just automatically think that you're a silly liberal, and that you don't have really anything to say, and that, well, there's just a lot of connotations. But
Right.
I think Saint Ignatius of Loyola might be an overlooked figure in the history of Catholic mysticism. And maybe we can have that conversation one day, and maybe we can just have another conversation about how the thousands of things that we talked about today. I really appreciate you taking the time. If I was thinking of like how I want to wrap this up, like what's the gist? I think, Zevi, I think you're trying to do a really beautiful job at remembering how reality once was and how it should be. And I think that's really the gist of to reframe or to just reword what your gist is. It's just trying to remember. I don't think these things have been lost. I don't
Hmm.
think that that's not how knowledge works. It's not like we discover knowledge and now
Right.
knowledge is it's out there.
Yeah.
This is out there. And we just need to find, we're not even find, it's there. That's the thing. It's there. We just have to, I like remembering. Maybe it's
Yes.
like oh, what's the word? When you lose your memory after a fall.
Okay. Like
What's that?
amnesia.
Yeah, it's like
Amne-
it's like we have this amnesia and we just need to we need to remember and like most people who have amnesia, they eventually wake up and maybe it takes some time to do it, but maybe it takes having, I don't know, experiences that you once had or experiences that are memorable to you or important to you to wake you up. And maybe I think that's what you're trying to do with your channel and your mission and your project.
I so appreciate it, Joe. I so appreciate being able to share and to remember with you, because it's certainly something which I need to be doing as well. And I don't want to make as if I'm saying anything original here. I'm really not. In any field, I think that in the work that you're going into now in psychology, I think a lot of the humanistic psychologists were very, very inspired by mysticism when we're making these points. And I'm not trying to do anything original. But this work of remembering is really so important, and it's a metaphor which many of the mystics of many traditions use, that we get lost in a state of amnesia, or in a state of a dream, a state in an illusion, and we have to wake up from that. And
yeah,
that's a metaphor which is used very beautifully in the East. It's used by Ibn Arabi in Sufism. It's used by the Baal Shem Tov in the Hasidic tradition. That we have to like wake up to the reality that we know is true. And one of the most beautiful metaphors, if I can give
wait,
one last image here, is the metaphor that like when we are a child in our mother's womb, we experience that divine embrace. We experience the grace of God. We experience the unity of reality. We experience the symbiosis of two hearts beating in one body. We experience that the nurturing and care and love, the infinite love of the divine mother, of the mother for the child in the womb. And when we leave the womb, in what psychologists are now referring to as the trauma of birth, we forget that. And there's a Jewish tradition of an angel, using the metaphor of the angelic, that comes and steals that knowledge from us, that memory. And the mystics are really trying to come back to the womb. They're trying to return. There's a lot of Freudian analysis here, and Martin Buber has his own beautiful, the Jewish existentialist philosopher has a lot of beautiful readings of this as well. But it's a sense of remembering our reality, both biologically, going back to the mother, and spiritually going back to the soul, and to the embrace of the divine, to the unity of reality, and to live from that place. That the womb in Hebrew is rechem, and rechem is the same etymology as rachamim, as mercy, as kindness.
oh wow,
To go
that's awesome.
to go
Okay.
back to go back to that space, to go back to the mercy, which is the reality. Like to go back to our inner child that knows that experience to be true. And it's the work of remembering. For the Kabbalists, it's the work of putting the body of God back together. That God's body is broken up into how many humans there in the world?
Sure.
16 billion, and to bring
Yeah.
those limbs back together one by one in loving unity. So I so appreciate the opportunity to share this and to remember with you.
I appreciate the opportunity. I really do. I mean, you're a pleasurable conversation, and I appreciate this. I really do. What's next? What's the next chapter in the book? I think I know what it is. Am I allowed to say it or no?
Yeah, tell me what's your guess? Because
I'm guessing something with Neoplatonism, right?
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you got real quick, if you just want to say, so you, John Vervaeke, who else?
There's Philip Home
Philip
from Let's Talk Religion, Justin Sledge from Esoterica, Angela Puka from Angela Symposium, and Dana Trell from The Modern Hermeticist.
Wonderful. And are those videos being recorded, or are those already finished?
So they're going to be released the last weekend of December, so like December 30th or something. I'm not sure where the individual creators are at. I know that some of them have already. I've recorded. I'm actually doing like a 3 or 4 in that series, and I've recorded the first 2, and I'm working on the second and the third and fourth. Sorry, third and fourth. So that's all happening. I'm very excited to be doing that collaboration. I have an interview series with some of the world's leading scholars of Jewish mysticism here in Jerusalem that I'm actually recording now on the campus where they're hosted. So that's exciting. That's going to be about a dozen weeks of interviews. So one a week. We have a collaboration with Philosophy Channels that's going to be YouTube wide. That's something that we've been working on for a few months. Just a lot of fun, exciting stuff. And we're reading the Enneads, Plotinus's Enneads. We're doing the live reading ones. Just fun stuff. Trying to have fun with it and trying to be serious and not too serious at the same time. And it's been a great ride. Thank God.
I really appreciate it, brother. And I honestly, I love this. I walk away from this conversation, meeting a stranger, but honestly, someone I call a friend now. So this has just been a really stellar, out of the park, second installment of Gist with Joe. I'm probably not going to get anyone who watches this anymore. Like I said, it's supposed to be a gist, but again, complex things needs a longer gist. So
yeah, yes.
And
I'm very much looking forward to it coming out and to be able to share it with my community as well. It will be an honor and a privilege.
I appreciate it, Zevi. Thanks everyone for watching. Check back next Tuesday when I interview the author C.R. Riley.